Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Japan, an aging population, soaring debts, and an economy in recession. Can Japan's new Prime Minister avoid decades of contraction? Also this week, Pakistan is Asia's best performing stock market, and the rally may have a long way to go despite the pandemic. Plus, famine, poverty, and uprisings. The stark warnings as the pandemic wipes out a decade of economic growth. Well, in the end, maybe in a conservative country, the choice of continuity was too appealing. Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga replaced his boss Shinzo Abe as Prime Minister. Abe stepped down as the country's longest-serving Prime Minister for health reasons. Suga's challenge is to pick up from where Abe left off and make sure the 20s are not a wasted decade. Abe had attempted to turn around the stale economy with a three-pronged revival plan. He had inherited an economy that struggled with deflation and slowing growth after the stock and property market crash in the 1990s. The effort had limited success, and ABENOMICS, as it was known, was more or less abandoned. The central bank introduced unconventional tools to tackle the country's problems, from driving interest rates into negative territory to quantitative easing, again with limited success. Right now, the economy is in its third straight quarter of recession. In the second quarter of this year, the economy shrank an annualized 28.1% due to the pandemic. To counter that, Abe initiated a $2 trillion stimulus program. The country's debts are expected to hit 268% of GDP by the end of the year. That's up about 40 percentage points from where Abe inherited. So what can we expect from Suga's premiership? Well, joining me now from Tokyo is NAOYA OSHIKUBO. NAOYA is a senior economist at Tokyo-based SUMITOMO MITSUI Trust Bank. Good to have you with us. So is Abenomics still relevant today?
Yes, it is. Abenomics is still very important because of its accommodative monetary policy and expansionary fiscal policy, which have kept the yen weak and have led Japanese stocks to rally. Because of Abenomics, Japan was able to break out of deflation. And now, with COVID-19, accommodative monetary policy and expansionary fiscal policy have kept the Japanese economy afloat.
So what do you think Suga will change, if anything, then, to Abenomics?
I think Suga's policies will be more or less the same as Abe's, but there may be some small differences. Suga will lay out goals that include breaking up an overly bureaucratic administration, promoting regulatory reform, and sticking the knife into vested interests. I expect him to push up the minimum wage, reduce mobile phone charges, offer permanent telemedicine, promote online education, and create a digital agency to promote digitalization of the government. Moreover, I think we'll see a restructuring of regional banks. As a result, growth in Japan may accelerate beyond the goals of Abenomics.
Do you think that will deal with some of the basic structural problems and challenges which still face Japan's economy? I mean, the basic one of which is an aging population, right?
As everybody knows, Japan has the oldest population in the world. Prime Minister Suga has said that he would announce countermeasures to the falling birth rate, such as fertility treatment. I expect this to go well. But it seems to be very difficult to stop the aging population. So, a growth strategy promoting a digital economy may be the key to boost Japan's economy. I expect Suga will succeed in promoting regulatory reform and sticking the knife into vested interests.
At the same time, all the expansionary measures you were talking about, they don't help the debt problem. Does Japan have a debt problem, do you think, at this point?
No, it doesn't. About 19% of Japan's government debt is financed by domestic entities. The Bank of Japan owns 44.2% of all outstanding Japanese government bonds. as of the end of March 2020, and remains the top buyer of these bonds. The second largest buyers are insurance companies and pension funds with 22.3%. We do not expect rising debt levels to raise alarm bells, as 90% of JGBs are held by domestic entities who are not active sellers. Private domestic entities need JGBs as a risk management tool and as collateral to trade with the BOJ. In addition, the BOJ has suppressed interest rates through its yield curve control policy. As long as the current BOJ policy and the composition of major JGB holders are sustained, we believe that it is unlikely that a debt crisis will occur in Japan.
But the debt to GDP ratio, Naoya, is high, isn't it?
But I don't think Suga will raise the consumption tax to finance the country's debt.
You don't think that what he said before the election that he's actually going to follow through on that, Ben?
I don't think Suga will raise a consumption tax. He has said that he didn't feel the necessity to introduce a consumption tax hike for 10 years. He will place more emphasis on economic recovery during after COVID-19 than fiscal reconstruction.
What about when it comes to international relationships? What do you see in store? Closer relationship with Washington?
Prime Minister Suga is said to have little diplomatic experience, but he says he will formulate foreign policy with help from Abe. Foreign Minister Motegi should also remain in his position. As a result, Japan's foreign policy will be based on a US-Japan alliance and will focus on relations with Asian countries as before. China is one of the biggest trading partners of Japan.
So where does it leave relationships with China if he moves closer to the US?
I think Suga will also place emphasis on the economic relationship with China. But amid US-China frictions, Suga will have a hard time building friendly relationships with the two superpowers at the same time.
Let's say for sure it looks like it's going to be a challenge. Thank you very much for your thoughts and comments and analysis on that.
Thank you.
Under the headline, "Are markets detached from reality?" we probably have another one that's raised eyebrows. Pakistan's KSE 100 has surged more than 36% since March this year, making it one of the best in Asia. Yet the rally may have a long way to go. The market is still 50% below its peak. It's extraordinary because Pakistan's economy was pretty fragile before the pandemic. After a $6 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund last year, the lender of last resort extended another $1.4 billion to tackle the health and economic crisis. Pakistan's unemployment rate is predicted to surge to 28%. That doesn't include informal day laborers. About 2/3 of the population, or 145 million people, are living in poverty. The nation is dependent on its diaspora to finance its spending. In the 12 months to the end of June, overseas Pakistanis sent back $23 billion. Compare that to its exports of just $21 billion. So let's find out what's behind that stock market surge. Joining me now from Karachi is AYUB KHUHRO. AYUB is the Chief Investment Officer at Karachi-based FAYSAL Funds. So what do you make of the stock market surge then, Mr. AYUB? Does it make any sense?
Well, the market is up 56% from its low in March when COVID was at its peak and the lockdowns were at their peak. So I would say there have been multiple positive factors that have contributed to this surge. We have to understand that
at the same time, Ayub, the debt ratio is increasing, right? And we're still dealing with the after effects of the whole coronavirus lockdown. To many, it's surprising that the stock market would be rising so fast at this point.
So we have to understand that Pakistan entered the IMF program last year, and it had started on a path of economic recovery and consolidation. And the confidence was just about to start at the locals when COVID-19 hit. And what happened was the economic team here was quick to understand the impact that COVID would have at the economy. They were quick to react towards monetary and fiscal stimulus, just as most countries in the globe did. But yes, the market's priced that in quickly and recovered quickly. And overall, we see the confidence returning back as the locals are primarily the people who drove this market. Foreigners have been net sellers in the market for the past 3 years because they had lack of focus on the economic stability of the country. But the IMF program added that confidence and the locals went on a buying spree. Obviously, the rate cut by the central bank by almost 600 basis points added to fuel to the fire there. So I would say that Pakistan is in such a sweet spot right now where foreigners have been net sellers for 3 years and their ability to sell more is very limited now. And the discount to the region is still there. So it's a great time for foreigners to enter the country again. The locals are there, and I see the market continuing on this path.
How key have the interventions by the Bank of Pakistan governor been? Things like you mentioned of slashing rates, extending loans to businesses.
Yes. So what happened was when COVID-19 came, the governor initially was on an economic consolidation path, but he quickly realized the impact it was going to have, and he started giving some easing in the monetary space. He cut the interest rates early on by a very small amount, and this was again dictated by the underlying fundamentals of the economy. But prudently, they kept gradually doing those rate cuts, and we can see now that he did it at a very prudent and a timely basis because a very fast, aggressive rate cut could have been detrimental for our country, in fact. So keeping in view our external accounts, keeping in our view our rupee, and the foreign exchange reserves that were gradually dropping before the IMF program came in, I think the governor did a great job while giving that stimulus, much needed stimulus to the economy. And it's not just the governor. I think he had a great team of professionals under him that helped him in this matter.
What do you make of the Prime Minister's handling of the pandemic then?
This is an unprecedented event in the history of this country, and most countries started to do a generic version of a lockdown that was followed up. Pakistan had its own prescription to it, and it was primarily a lockdown with some focused treatments to those areas where there was a majority of focus of the cases here, active cases here. So I would say Imran Khan handled it well in terms of achieving the target, which is to contain the disease. And it was not just him. He had a great team at various levels of the government that gave the decisions it was a series of decisions. Because as you can see, the federation at a different level, provinces are at a different level, and both coordinated to contain this epidemic at the early stages. So it gives me confidence that the Imran Khan government has the ability to contain such a big crisis. So I would say hats off to him.
In a recent interview with Al Jazeera, Imran Khan spoke about the economic future being linked to the Chinese economy. Is that a good thing? Is that a good direction?
Yes, I would say so. It's a good thing because if you look at history for the past 30 years, the Chinese economy has been going phenomenally well. And linking yourself to that economy is, from an economic standpoint of view, I think it's a great move by the government. Unfortunately, the West cannot offer that kind of growth because it's just not there. So linking up with China from a purely economic standpoint is a great thing for this government. And we can debate about the finer aspects of the growth, but that's a separate argument.
What about the Belt and Road Initiative? Is that delivering for Pakistan?
From a local standpoint, I would say it's a long-term project. The Silk Road or the Belt and One Road Initiative is a long-term project, and the fruits of it are starting to pay off. You can't look at it at a very short-term pace of it. You have to look at the long-term dividends that this country is going to benefit from it, especially from the early infrastructure projects that China set up in Pakistan, from the power projects it set up here. So I think without those projects, our GDP growth path would have been much different. And if you look at globally, economic interconnectedness is what brings countries together. And this One Road Initiative is getting us towards that path where within the region, we can have better interconnectivity, better economic prosperity.
But it's coming at a cost of being indebted to China, which, as you know, I'm sure, some in the West are warning countries about. Should Pakistan be worried or cautious about that?
Debt is debt, Sami. So I agree that debt depends on what covenants you sign and what type of debt you take on. If it's a very aggressive debt, it can be detrimental to your country. But in this case, every country chooses their own path to economic growth. We've chosen using debt from China, and I don't think. Look at the long-term impact of the One Belt, One Road initiative, and it's not something like they are going to give us debt and make us trapped in that debt and then use us for that One Belt, One Road initiative. So I think it's a longer-term project, and they will not shoot themselves in the foot by compromising in Pakistan on their projects here. So look at it from a long-term perspective. I don't think this is going to happen, and I don't buy that argument.
All right, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much, AYUB KHUHRO.
Thank you.
There are warnings. The world is on the brink of a hunger pandemic. Charity Oxfam says up to 12,000 people could starve to death each day because of coronavirus-related restrictions. In India, malnutrition is already a threat to life, and the UN says the pandemic is making that worse. Elizabeth Paranam has more from New Delhi.
Sheila Devi's relatives have come to her home to comfort the mother of two. Her 5-year-old daughter Sonia died after having diarrhea. Sheila says it's because they couldn't afford to feed her while she was sick.
She died hungry and thirsty. There was nothing to eat. What do we eat? There is no work. Even if I go looking for work, there is none.
Sonia is just one of nearly 2,000 under 5-year-olds who die every day in India with malnutrition, the underlying cause. And the UN has warned of more hunger and malnutrition because of the increase in unemployment and poverty during the coronavirus pandemic. The Indian government says it's spending $20 billion on giving free rice, wheat and lentils to 800 million households, but help isn't reaching everyone. Non-government aid organizations continue to fill the gap left by the state. New Scientist magazine says 115 million Indian children who are dependent on daily school lunches are on the verge of malnourishment because of prolonged school closures. The NGO Child Rights and You has been feeding the children, the people of this West Delhi neighborhood for the past 15 years and says it's never been as busy as it has this year. Sonia, who's pregnant with her first child, collects free rations with which she feeds herself and her 10-year-old nephew Zahid. Her husband has been looking for a job since the factory he used to work in closed months ago.
We've come to stay at our sister-in-law's to eat because we didn't have any food at home. The rations have helped us. We could eat a little because there were days when we would go to bed hungry.
The situation changes very quickly, eh?
The UN's children's agency UNICEF says addressing malnutrition must remain a priority.
There's so much effort going to preventing and managing the huge numbers of COVID and taking that it doesn't spread more. But at the same time, we should not lose all the efforts made into stopping malnutrition and losing a lot of the progress that has been made in the last few years.
For Sheila Devi, the death of her daughter couldn't be more painful. Her 5-year-old son also died from hunger during the economic crisis in India 4 years ago.
Now, the warnings are coming in thick and fast, with the United Nations saying Yemen, South Sudan and northeastern Nigeria, as well as the Democratic Republic of Congo, all facing the first famines of the coronavirus era. All 4 countries had been in the midst of conflict and food deprived as aid agencies were unable to operate freely. The decade of poverty reduction in some of the poorest nations is about to be wiped out as the International Monetary Fund, backing calls from the World Bank for creditors to cut debt rather than just offering interest payment relief. The stark warnings come as risk analysis firm Verisk Maplecroft identified 37 nations that face major spikes in unrest due to painful post-pandemic economic recovery. And Maplecroft's lead economist, David Willey, joins us now. Good to have you with us. So is it too late to stop decades of economic gains evaporating at this point?
Yes, the global economy has been devastated by the coronavirus pandemic, and wealthy nations are no exception to that. About a month ago, we released the results of our recovery capacity index to help our clients understand what that next phase of the recovery looks like, looking out into the next few months and into 2021. How rapidly do we see countries recovering from the economic slowdown? And when we look at just the G20 economies, these are the 20 largest economies in the world, what our data predict is that you're going to see a two-track recovery emerging. So on the one hand, countries in Western Europe and East Asia that were initially hardest hit by the pandemic, they ultimately have the underlying resilience that's going to allow them to bounce back relatively quickly from the downturn. On the other hand, you've got major emerging markets that are now forming the global epicenter of the pandemic. These are places like India, Brazil, South Africa, countries that suffered a very severe setback economically from the pandemic, and their economies were already growing slowly even before coronavirus. They are the places where our data say are most at risk of stagnating, long after their peers in Western Europe and East Asia have recovered.
So quite scary for those developing countries. What about the debt burden? How does that factor into the outlook, especially for low-income countries?
Yes, so debt doesn't play a direct input into our assessment of recovery capacity, but it is a significant follow-on risk factor for some, and it threatens to be exacerbated by this potential prolonged period of economic slowdown. So we're expecting to see low-income countries reversing gains in things like tackling poverty, reducing inequality, shrinking the size of the informal sector. But as these poverty rolls, grow, and as more and more of the unemployed are forced to take on informal labor, that is going to deny governments much needed tax revenues at the exact same time that their budget deficits are exploding in order to support individuals and businesses hit by the coronavirus pandemic. So that is going to put severe strains on government finances, and we're already seeing major economies like South Africa, for example, being forced to turn to the IMF, take on more than $4 billion in emergency lending this year. We at Maplecroft are now forecasting that South Africa has a 50% probability of being forced to take on a full bailout with the IMF before the end of the year in order to support its major debt payments coming due over the next couple of years.
That's quite worrying. I mean, where does all of this debt ballooning end? With write-offs and cancellations, or with a bubble burst?
Well, we've seen major international organizations like the OECD temporarily suspending debt payments, and we've seen the IMF open up its emergency lending program and some unprecedented volume of lending to low-income countries. But it's just not clear once those programs are sort of turned off and things go back to normal, where debt burden is going to go from there following the recovery from the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a big question. What about the rise of populism? It's being blamed for undermining democracy in some countries. How is that going to prove to be a challenge in pandemic recovery mode?
Sure. So strength of country institutions is a key element of how we assess and measure countries' recovery capacity. And it's actually a defining feature of the countries that are at highest risk of stagnating after the pandemic, that they are struggling with weak institutions, that's undermining their country resilience. So threats to democracy from rising populism, for example, or rising authoritarianism are ultimately, we believe, going to hold back their economic recoveries. But then at the same time, a period of prolonged economic slowdown is going to exacerbate some of these underlying social tensions and could lead to additional risk factors such as civil unrest. And that's a major risk factor that we are measuring in our recovery capacity data set. So we're seeing this play out in places like India, Hong Kong, Thailand, Belarus, and of course in the United States right now. We've seen it have a significant negative impact on the economies of places like Chile and Venezuela. but it could also potentially alter the course of elections coming up in places like the Americas and also the election in the United States in November.
All right, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much, David Willey there.
Thank you very much.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan. From the whole team here, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.